The Woman Who Sought Gold. A Story of the American West, 1850, Part 1. What the Earth Takes. The morning Thomas Calloway died, the sky above the Missouri River Valley was the color of old pewter, flat and cold and indifferent as the sky tends to be when it decides to swallow a man whole. He had gone out before dawn to check on the mare, who had been laboring since midnight with a foal that refused to come easy into the world. Eleanor found him 2 hours later, slumped against the fence post, nearest the barn, one hand still resting on the slats as though he had simply paused to rest and forgot to start again. The mare had survived. The foal had not, and neither, it seemed, had the heart of Thomas Calloway, which had finally given out after 41 years of stubborn, tireless use. Eleanor knelt in the frost-bitten mud beside her husband for a long time. She did not weep immediately. She was not a woman given to immediate things. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck the way her mother had taught her who had grown up on a Mississippi farm where death was a regular visitor and sentimentality a luxury no one could afford. And when she found nothing there, she simply sat back on her heels and looked at him, at the strong jaw gone slack, at the hands that had built this house with their own raw determination, board by board, nail by nail, over the course of a single brutal summer 12 years ago. At the face she had woken beside for 11 of those 12 years. "All right," she said aloud, to no one, or perhaps to him. "All right, then." She was 34 years old. She had 200 acres of Missouri farmland, a debt of $460 owed to the First Agricultural Bank of St. Joseph, a mule named Cicero, a milk cow, 3 chickens, and $12 in paper money hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the kitchen. She had no children, a grief she and Thomas had quietly agreed never to speak of aloud, the way people agree not to press on a bruise that never quite heals. She had neighbors 2 miles east and 3 miles west, and neither of them were the kind of neighbors who would carry your trouble without eventually requiring something in return. The bank had been patient with Thomas. His charming, broad-shouldered patience, his firm handshake, his ability to look a creditor in the eye and make the man feel, somehow, that he himself owed Thomas a favor. These were gifts Eleanor did not possess and had never tried to imitate. She had other gifts. She could read a weather sky better than any almanac. She could dress a wound, mend a harness, calculate seed-to-yield ratios in her head while walking the rows. She could endure. But she could not charm a banker when Elias Horn, of the First Agricultural Bank of St. Joseph, rode up the following month to offer his condolences and then, in the same breath, to inquire about the status of the loan. Eleanor met him on the porch with a cup of coffee and a measured gaze. He was a small man with large ambitions, the kind who wore his waistcoat even in summer and always seemed vaguely disappointed in what he found before him. 6 months, she said. "I'll have your money in 6 months." He stirred his coffee. He looked at the fields, winter-brown and still, and then at the farmhouse, calculating its worth the way men like him always did, with their eyes rather than their hearts. "Mrs. Calloway, with all due respect." 6 months, Mr. Horn." He left. She watched his horse pick its careful way down the frozen road, and she stood there until he was gone from sight. And then she went inside and spread Thomas's old maps across the kitchen table and sat down to think. The news from California had been coming east for 2 years by then, carried on the tongues of men who had gone and men who had returned and men who had heard from men who had returned. Gold in the streams, gold in the gravel, gold lying in the open like a dare from God to any man bold enough to accept it. Eleanor had listened to these stories the way she listened to most talk of extraordinary things, with a quiet, practical skepticism. But she had also, in the privacy of her own mind, done the mathematics. A successful claim, even a modest one, could yield enough in a single season to pay off the bank, pay off the seed debt, pay off the small loan from Thomas's brother in Kentucky. Enough to come home free. She was not a gambling woman, but she understood the difference between a gamble and a calculated risk, and she understood that the farm, left untended through another year of debt, was itself a kind of gamble. A slow one, with worse odds. She spent 2 weeks making arrangements. The cow went to the Hendersons 2 miles east, on loan, with the understanding that whatever milk and cheese she produced was theirs to keep until Eleanor returned. The chickens she gave outright. She packed a single trunk, tools, clothes, her medical kit, Thomas's compass and pocket watch, the maps and every book she had allowed herself to keep when practical necessity had forced her to sell most of the others. She packed $12 in paper money and the gold wedding band she took from Thomas's finger before they buried him, wrapped in a square of linen and tucked inside her boot. She sewed an additional $20 she had earned selling the farm's remaining stores into the lining of her coat. She loaded Cicero and hitched him to the small wagon Thomas had used for hauling, and on the 17th of March, 1850, with the ground still faintly hard from the tail end of winter, Eleanor Calloway turned her face west. Part 2. The Width of the World. The first thing you learned on the overland trail was that distance is not the same thing as space. Eleanor had understood this, intellectually, before she left. She had studied the maps. She knew the miles. Roughly 2,000 of them between St. Joseph and the gold fields of California, through territory that included prairie, desert, mountain range, and every variety of weather that a continent at the height of its indifference could produce. She knew this as a fact the way you know a fact from a book, cleanly, abstractly, without feeling. What she had not known was the weight of it. The way 2,000 miles felt different on the skin than it looked on paper. The way the horizon never changed when you were moving through flat country, so that you might travel for a week and still feel, in some unreasonable part of your body, that you had gone nowhere at all. She joined a wagon train out of St. Joseph. 23 wagons, mostly families, a handful of single men, one other woman traveling alone whose name was Mrs. Phoebe Marsh and who was going to California to join her son. Eleanor and Phoebe found each other on the first day with the instinct of two people who recognize in each other the same particular brand of quiet competence. They did not become intimate friends. They became something more useful, reliable allies. The wagon master was a man named Cord Hatchet, who had made the crossing twice before and wore both of those crossings visibly in his face, which was the color and texture of old saddle leather. He looked at Eleanor on the morning of departure, with an expression that was not quite skepticism and not quite respect, but something suspended between the two. "You understand the trail," he said. "I've read everything published about it," she said, "and I know that reading and understanding are different things. Tell me what I don't know." He studied her for a moment, then allowed himself a small nod, as though she had passed some invisible preliminary examination. "Water," he said. "Everything on this trail comes back to water. Where to find it, how much you need, what to do when you run out. After that, it's the animals. Your mule healthy?" "He's 7 years old and stubborn as original sin," she said. "He'll outlast us both." This proved largely accurate. Cicero was, in fact, the single most reliable element of Eleanor's entire journey. The prairie was beautiful in a way she had not expected and was not prepared for. She had grown up in Missouri, which was rolling and wooded and intimate in its landscapes, a world of enclosed spaces and sheltered prospects. The prairie was nothing like this. It was open to a degree that felt almost aggressive, a landscape that refused to let you hide anything from it. Not your size, not your solitude, not the smallness of your wagon against the immensity of the sky. Eleanor found it unsettling for the first week. then compelling, and then by the third week, she understood that she had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing your own heartbeat. It was simply the constant condition in which she existed. She learned the rhythms of the trail, the early starts before dawn to beat the heat, the midday rest when the animals needed it most, the evening camps with their particular smell of wood smoke and animal sweat and cooking fat, the morning inventory of wheels and harnesses and water barrels that became as automatic as breathing. She watched everything and asked questions without embarrassment, because she had long since dispensed with the particular vanity of pretending to know things she did not. She asked Cord Hatchet about river crossings. She asked a former mountain man named Greer about reading the land for water. She asked a young farm wife from Indiana about which plants along the trail were edible and which would lay you flat for a week. What she did not do was explain herself to anyone who was not directly useful to her journey. There were men in the train who watched her with a curiosity that held a faint edge of something else. Not quite challenge, not quite contempt, but a species of waiting, as though they expected her to eventually require saving. She disappointed all of them. She fixed her own wagon wheel when it cracked on the Kansas plain, working alongside a young man named Arturo, who offered help with a sincerity she appreciated and repaid with honest labor beside him. She treated a fever in the Hendrickson child with the herbs from her medical kit and the knowledge stored in her mother's careful teaching. She pulled Cicero out of a muddy river crossing by main force and the application of a very specific vocabulary she had developed over years of farming. The trail was not cruel. It was simply indifferent, which is a different thing and in some ways harder. Cruelty you can argue with. Indifference simply is. A man named Beaumont died of cholera somewhere in Nebraska Territory. They buried him on the slope of a hill with a wooden marker and moved on the next morning because the trail did not accommodate grief's preferred schedule. Eleanor had sat with his wife through the night, not speaking much, only being present in that particular way she had learned was sometimes more useful than words. In the morning, when it was time to move, the widow Beaumont looked at Eleanor with eyes that had cried themselves empty and said, "How do you do it? How do you keep going?" Eleanor thought about this honestly, which was the only way she knew to think about anything. "I suppose," she said finally, "because stopping has worse consequences than going." It was not wisdom, it was just arithmetic. But the widow Beaumont seemed to find it sufficient, and she climbed back onto her wagon, and they moved on. Part 3. The Mountain and the Desert. They parted ways with the Colorado River and turned southwest into the desert sometime in late July. And the desert was everything the maps had implied and still managed to be worse than expected. Eleanor had crossed hot country in Missouri summers. She had known thirst and the particular dull headache that comes with sustained heat. She had known none of this. The desert was a different category of heat entirely, a heat that seemed to have purpose and intention, that pressed down on the top of the skull and worked inward, that turned the air into something that required effort to breathe. The light was white and absolute, and threw no shadow in the midday hours, so that the landscape looked flat and slightly unreal, like an overexposed daguerreotype. Cicero suffered. This was the hardest thing, harder than her own discomfort, because Cicero could not understand what was happening to him or why, and his suffering was therefore purer and more straightforward than any human suffering she witnessed. She rationed his water with the same precision she applied to her own, keeping careful count of the barrels, calculating miles against supply with the daily discipline of someone who understood that this particular calculation was the difference between arriving and not arriving. She lost 8 pounds in the desert. She knew she ate what there was to eat and moved when it was possible to move and rested when rest was the more strategic option, and she kept her maps updated each evening in the small leather journal she had brought for this purpose, marking water sources and landmarks and the condition of the road in the compressed, practical prose she used for everything. There was a night in the desert. She did not know the date, had lost track of the calendar somewhere in Nevada territory. When she climbed to the top of a small rock formation above the camp and sat there alone, under a sky so dense with stars that it seemed less like sky and more like a ceiling someone had perforated with 1,000,000 small holes to let the light from somewhere else shine through. Below, she thought about him. Not the way she usually thought about him, which was practical and inventory-oriented, reviewing what she had to do and what he would have done differently, but simply about his presence, the specific gravity of a person you have known well, the way absence has a weight of its own that doesn't diminish, only becomes more familiar. "I'm going to manage it," she told the watch, or him, or the space where he had been. "I'm going to come home." The Sierra Nevada were the last obstacle, and they were significant. Eleanor had read the accounts of the Donner Party and filed them under useful information. What happens when mountain travel is attempted too late in the season, when preparation is inadequate, when leadership fails? She and Cord Hatchett had argued, quietly and persistently, about the timing of the Sierra crossing. He wanted to push faster. She wanted to push smarter. In the end, they split the difference and arrived at the mountains in mid-September, which was later than ideal, but still within the window before the high passes became genuinely dangerous. The climb was 3 days of sustained effort that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. Not as a series of events, but as a single, sustained physical sensation. The pull in every muscle, the thin, cold air that required concentrated effort to use. The way Cicero leaned into his harness with a patience and determination that she found genuinely moving. The other travelers struggled around them. Eleanor kept climbing. She had discovered, somewhere in the desert, that her body had developed an entirely new relationship with hardship. Not tolerance exactly, more like understanding. The body's suffering had ceased to feel like an emergency and had become simply information. This much harder, this much longer, this much more to ask of yourself today. At the summit, she stopped the wagon and looked west for a long time without speaking. Below her, impossibly far below it seemed, like looking down from a cloud, California unrolled itself in the afternoon light, green and golden and improbably lush after the months of brown and gray and dust. She could see the valley. She could see, or imagine she could see, the glint of water in the rivers that ran through it. She allowed herself, for the first time on the journey, a moment of uncomplicated feeling. Not triumph. She had not arrived yet, and premature triumph was a luxury she distrusted. But something close to certainty. The particular peace of a person who has done a hard thing and knows now that they can finish it. "All right," she said, as she had said to Thomas in the frost-bitten mud of the Missouri morning that felt like a century ago. "All right, then." She clicked to Cicero, and they began the descent. Part 4. The fields of Gold Coloma was not what she expected. She did not know precisely what she expected. Something raw, perhaps, more obviously violent in its newness. But the town that had grown up around Sutter's Mill in the year since Marshall had found that first glint in the American River was already something between a camp and a settlement, with a kind of improvised permanence that surprised her. There were buildings, there were streets of a sort. There was noise of a particular quality she associated with concentrations of men with money and intention. A dense, layered noise that included commerce and argument and music and the particular bass note of machinery working at something hard. There were also very few women. Eleanor had known this, intellectually, from everything she had read. The reality was still striking. She drove Cicero down the main street and felt the particular attention of a conspicuous person, in a place where her conspicuousness was not the usual kind. Men looked at her with curiosity, with surprise, with a range of expressions she catalogued and mostly ignored. She was not here to be remarkable. She was here to work. She spent her first 2 days gathering information with the same systematic efficiency she had applied to the trail. She talked to everyone who would talk to her. Miners, merchants, the 2 other women she found in the camp who were willing to be candid, a former surveyor named Augustin, who had spent a season working the American River and now ran a supply store. She listened more than she spoke. She asked precise questions and took the answers seriously, even when they contradicted each other, which they frequently did. What she learned was this: the easy gold, the gold lying in the stream beds in visible nuggets, the gold of the early stories, was largely gone from the most accessible claims. What remained required either deeper work, better equipment, or the willingness to go farther into less claimed territory. She had a small amount of money, moderate stamina, and a very high tolerance for discomfort. She elected to go farther. The claim she filed was 12 miles from Coloma, up a tributary of the South Fork of the American River, in a canyon whose walls were steep enough to discourage casual visitors, and whose stream ran cold and clear, in a way that Augustin, the former surveyor, had told her, with the authority of someone who had learned to read land for its secrets, was the way to look for. She had paid him $30 for 2 days of his time as a guide and consultant, and she considered this among the best investments of the journey. She built her camp with the same practical competence she had brought to everything else. A tent first, then a more permanent lean-to with materials available from the canyon itself, then a proper rocker box for processing gravel, assembled from a set of plans she had studied in St. Joseph, and modified based on what she had observed in Coloma. She was not the most efficient miner in California. She was, she suspected, among the most organized. The work was physical, beyond what she had imagined, which was saying something. Because she had imagined physical work on a scale most people would find discouraging: shoveling gravel, hauling water, running the roca, which required a steady rhythmic motion for hours at a time that worked every muscle in the upper body into a particular deep ache. She grew to recognize the way you recognize an old acquaintance, not fondly, but familiarly. She worked 6 days a week, resting on Sunday, not from religious conviction, but because she had noticed that miners who worked 7 days straight became increasingly careless. And carelessness had consequences. The gold came slowly, not in the dramatic rushes of the newspaper stories, not in the gleaming chunks that appeared in illustrations meant to draw more men west. It came in fine flakes and occasional small grains, accumulated over hours and days of patient work, measured each evening by the light of her lantern, in the small scale she had bought in Coloma. A 1/4 ounce on a good day, 1/2 ounce rarely, and when it happened, she allowed herself a quiet, private satisfaction before returning to the arithmetic. She kept the gold in a tin box, locked with a key, she wore on a cord around her neck. There were other miners in the canyon. 3 men working a claim, 1/2 mile upstream. A partnership of 2 brothers from Georgia, whose claim was 1/2 mile below. The brothers, whose names were Cal and Dermot Frazier, watched her initial arrival with the open skepticism that was becoming familiar to her by now, and then, after about 2 weeks, began to simply treat her as a feature of the landscape, which was the best possible outcome. Cal, the younger one, occasionally brought her fish from the stream, without explanation or expectation of thanks, which she interpreted correctly as a form of respect. The men upstream were less friendly, but not hostile. They had staked their claim first and worried, as miners always worried, about someone jumping it. Eleanor made very clear from the beginning, by the placement of her stakes and the direction of her work, that she had no interest in their claim, and after this was established, they subsided into mutual indifference. She worked through October and into November. The weather turned. The creek rose with the first mountain rains, and she spent 3 days rerouting her operation to stay above the new water line, which was both exhausting and, when she had finished, quietly satisfying in the way that solved problems always were. She ate simply, dried beans and cornmeal and whatever fresh food she could acquire on her twice-monthly trips to Coloma for supplies. She read in the evenings by firelight, working through the books she had carried across 2,000 miles, and then, when she had read them all, she began corresponding with herself in the leather journal, writing long accounts of the work and the land and the calculations, as though she were writing to someone who needed to understand everything precisely. In early December, she found the pocket. It was 22 inches below the surface gravel, in a layer of decomposed granite, that her shovel hit with a sound that was subtly different from the sounds above it. Denser, heavier, a note lower in pitch. She stopped when she heard it. She cleared the overlying material with unusual care, and found the pocket. 6 ounces of gold in a space roughly the size of her 2 fists pressed together, clustered in the granite like something that had been placed there deliberately, like a secret someone had decided to share. She sat back on her heels in the cold canyon mud and looked at it for a long time. Then she took Thomas's pocket watch from her coat and held it open in one hand, and looked at the face. The careful face he had wound every night before bed. The face that still, impossibly, kept perfect time. And she breathed slowly and steadily in the cold mountain air until her heart returned to its normal pace. She processed the pocket carefully over the following 2 days, cataloging every gram. In total, 6 ounces, 4 pennyweights, and 7 grains. At the current price, this alone was worth more than the bank debt. Part 5. The Road Home. She left California in February of 1851, heading south and then east on a route that avoided the Sierra in winter and added weeks to the journey but kept her alive and functional, which she considered the relevant variable. She carried her gold, wrapped in layers of wool inside a false bottom she had constructed in Cicero's pack saddle, a hiding place she had designed in her head during the long evenings in the canyon and executed in Coloma, with tools borrowed from a carpenter named Delacroix, who asked no questions. She had, in total, 11 months of accumulated work, plus the pocket. Just over 40 ounces of gold dust and small nuggets, worth at the going rate approximately $640. Enough to pay Elias Horn his $460. Enough to seed the farm for the next 2 seasons. Enough to carry her through whatever came next, with a small margin of reserve. The return journey was slower, and in some ways, harder than the outward one. Going west had purpose in it, the purposefulness of someone moving toward a thing. Going east required a different kind of will, the will to maintain direction when the destination was familiar rather than unknown, when what waited for you was the everyday shape of your own life rather than the heightened drama of the frontier. She found herself, in the long hours on the trail, thinking about the farm with a specificity she had not permitted herself during the going out, the particular light on the back field in March, the sound the house made in wind, the way the Missouri River smelled in spring, which was rich and complicated and entirely distinct from the smell of any other water she had encountered on 2,000 miles of trail. She thought about Thomas less frequently now, which she initially felt guilty about and then decided was probably correct. The dead require our mourning, not our constant company. She had mourned. She was still mourning in the way you mourn something that has become part of the landscape of yourself rather than a wound that needs tending. She carried him in the pocket watch, in the compass, in the very habits of thought that his life alongside hers had shaped. She would carry him home. She arrived back in Missouri in late April, 11 months and 12 days after she had left. The farm was as she had left it, more or less. The house standing, the fences mostly intact, the fields waiting with the patient indifference of land for someone to come back and tend them. The Hendersons had kept the cow well. The neighbors to the west had mended one section of fence that the winter had brought down and left her a note about it tucked under the front door. Calloway Place. Fixed the north fence. Spring Bill will come round eventually. G. Wickham. She folded the note and put it in the journal. She rode to St. Joseph the second morning back. She had washed the trail from her face and put on the best dress she had brought, which was not particularly fine, but was clean and whole and respectable. And she rode Cicero with the gold in the pack saddle and tied him at the post outside the First Agricultural Bank of St. Joseph, and went inside. Elias Horn was behind his desk. He looked up when she entered, and she watched his face pass through recognition, surprise, calculation, and a hasty reconstruction of expression into something more professionally neutral, all in the space of about 3 seconds. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "we had understood you might have left the state." "I've been in California," she said. She placed the bag on his desk. $460. "I believe that covers the outstanding balance." He counted it. He counted it twice, which she expected, and then he wrote the receipt in his careful banker's hand and stamped it and handed it across the desk to her. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket, over her heart, next to the pocket watch. Outside, she untied Cicero and stood for a moment on the street of St. Joseph in the April sunshine. Men walked past on their own business. A dog crossed the road. Somewhere down the street, someone was hammering, building something new, as someone was always building something new in Missouri in 1851, because the country was always in the process of becoming something it had not yet finished becoming, which was both the most exhausting and the most sustaining thing about it. Eleanor set her foot in the stirrup and swung up onto Cicero's back and turned him east, toward home. Epilogue. She farmed the land for another 26 years. She never went to California again, though she followed the news of it with the particular attention of someone who has earned the right to an opinion. She never remarried, not for lack of opportunity. The frontier had a way of making practical proposals practical. But because the life she had built was hers in a way she had not expected and did not want to complicate. She took in a girl named Sarah, whose family had come through a bad winter badly, and raised her from 11 until she was grown. And Sarah Calloway was what she was called until she married a farmer from the next county over and became someone else's wife, though she came back often enough and with children enough that the farm was never quite silent. Eleanor lived to 71. She was buried on the farm, in the grove of oaks on the south ridge where Thomas was buried, beside him, but in her own plot, with her name cut cleanly in the stone. Eleanor Calloway, 1816 to 1887. She went west and came home. The pocket watch she left to Sarah. The compass she buried with Thomas, returning it to the earth with the man who had first taught her to use it, in the winter of his going out and her first solitary spring. The last entry, written on the evening of her return to the farm, read, April 30th, 1851. Home by 4 o'clock. House sound. South field, once turning. The evening light is as I remembered it. Tomorrow I will begin. End.